Here in Bossenden Wood in 1838, the King of Jerusalem and the Gypsies and the Prince of Arabia fought the last battle on British soil against the British Army. This tale was inspired by an expat in California. Welcome to Kentish Tales and Tales of Kent, stories of this great and wonderful county. In 1832, Sir William, Henry, Percy, Honeywood, Courtney stood for election here in Canterbury. He was known as a little bit of an eccentric. He was a very tall man with a luscious beard, and he wore a turban, and wherever he went he carried a sword. Local people flocked to him as he told tales of being the King of Jerusalem, of having met Hester Stanhope, a hermit who ruled over Lebanon. Everyone was very excited about the upcoming election. People working in the fields found him very interesting. This was hardly surprising. For hundreds of years, life in Kentish fields kind of largely remained the same. However, by this time, the 1830s, things had begun to change. With the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, land had become more enclosed. There was less common land for people to feed any of their animals on. Also, with the coming of threshing machines, there was less and less work available. For your average farm labourer, they would get paid in the spring, they would get paid in the summer, they would get paid in the autumn, but in the winter they get paid nothing because they had very little to do. This meant that they would have to rely on poor relief. This led to what are called the swing riots. We'll cover that at some other point, where ricks were burnt and threshing machines were destroyed all across Kent. Amongst all of this, Courtney turned up, and as Dickens wrote, he was always amongst them, the turnip hoers, the stone pickers, as they rose from their task. For a moment's rest would often start, we are told, and find this man standing beside them, as if he had suddenly risen out of the earth. All along the Stour Valley, in many a gable-ended farmhouse, hidden up among the clustering hops and wooded hills, this man from Canterbury, with the supernatural sort of face, was looked upon with a reverence and awe, as a prophet sent by God to make bread cheaper and to redress poor men's wrongs. So it was no wonder the farm labourers loved Courtney. They saw him as a bit of inspiration, as he said that we should not be taxing the poor, but we should be taxing the rich. Unfortunately for them, most of them didn't have a vote, so Courtney lost the election, and then he stood again and lost again. But he wasn't perturbed. He carried on doing his good work, explaining to people about his tall tales from his travels in the Middle East and how the poor peasants of this world should not have to suffer as they did. And at one point he found himself in Deal. When he looked out to sea, what should he see but a little boat being pursued by one Royal Navy clipper. Now it turned out these people had been accused of being smugglers. They said we were nothing of the sort. The barrels that we were apparently throwing over the board were actually there all along. And Courtney said, that's true, I saw it with my own eyes here in Deal. And so case closed. It would appear that they were innocent. That was until the vicar from here, Bourton under Blean, stood up and went, actually, Courtney wasn't there at Deal. He can't have been, because he was at christening here. Uh-oh. So, William Courtney was put on trial for perjury and was found extraordinarily guilty. He was sent to Maidstone prison to await transportation to Australia. At this point, a woman turned up with a Cornish accent, and she said, his name isn't William Courtney, he's my husband, and his name is John Tom. John Tom was born in St Columb in Cornwall in 1799.
Is that Cornish enough for you?
That's very Cornish.
The son of innkeepers. At the age of 18 he began work as a clerk. He briefly was an innkeeper in Wadebridge, and then he made his living as a wine clerk in Truro. He married a local girl called Catherine and set up his business in wine and spirits. He was nearly 6 feet tall, broad in proportions and handsome in a kind of dark fashion. He was apparently immensely strong. He could hold 56 pounds straight away from his body. Also had a reputation as one of the finest cricketers in all of Cornwall. He soon started to face problems, however. His mother had some form of a breakdown and was placed in a mental asylum. His business burnt down in 1828. And soon all of this got to John Tom, and he too began to suffer from mental problems. Doctors said he had a congestion of the brain and said he had monomania. Their solution was to apply the leeches to him and have him bled thoroughly. But soon he was back in business and sailed to Truro and then on to Liverpool and then moved on to Birmingham. But it was here that he wrote to his wife saying that he had gone to France. He then disappeared. She had heard nothing of him until she came across a newspaper article about a perjury trial and somebody who sounded vaguely familiar. When Catherine was allowed in the prison, she met Courtney Tom and she said, "Yes, that's my husband." But Courtney Tom was having none of it. He said, "That's not my wife." She mentioned how years ago he'd been treated for madness by doctors down in Cornwall, and local doctors examined him here in Maidstone and they decided he wasn't fit for transportation. He was insane and needed to go to Barming Mental Asylum. This is Barming Asylum. Now some rather pleasant apartments, but this is where John Tom was sent. Now he was apparently a very model prisoner. He didn't have to shave his head like all the others, and he wasn't even asked to wear a uniform like everyone else. He behaved himself so well that his father thought perhaps he should be released, so he got in contact with Sir Hussey Vivian, who was the MP for Cornwall, and he had a word with Lord Russell, who then managed to get a pardon from Queen Victoria on one condition, that he went home and lived with his wife Catherine and went back to Cornwall with his whole family. However, he was having none of it. He said, "I'm going back to Canterbury." They said, "Fine, as long as you can stay with somebody respectable." So he was going to move in with a Mr. Francis, and one more condition: he were not to perform any more political acts. John Tom agreed, but he was going to break that promise in a big way. When he returned to the fields around Canterbury, he found the situation even worse. The new poor law had been passed. This meant that any workers over the winter months would not be able to rely on charity anymore. No, they'd be put in the workhouse. One such person was George Branchett. He and his wife had to go into the workhouse in Faversham in the winter of 1836 when they ran out of money. He and his 6 children went in alongside his wife. His wife did not come out. She died, as did 4 of his children. He was so poor he had to ask for further poor relief to enable him to bury his own family. On the 29th of May 1838, Courtney began to be seen in the lanes of Canterbury carrying bread on a pole signifying revolt, alongside it the flag with a red lion on. No longer was anyone referring to him as John Tom. He moved through the villages of Kent and called on people to join him, and he said he would provide provisions. George Branchett was one of the men who joined him. At this point, Reverend John Poor, the Justice of the Peace for the area, issued a warrant for the arrest of Courtney, accusing him of disrupting the workers of the area. But where had Courtney gone? Everyone knew where Courtney was. He was over at Bossenden Farm with William Culver, his wife, and his daughter, the daughter whom Courtney was apparently having an affair with. So Nicholas and John Mears, local constabulary, were sent along to arrest Courtney. When they got to the farm, Courtney pulled out a knife and stabbed Nicholas, dragging his body into a ditch. It was all John could do to escape. Courtney apparently said, "This is the first day of the millennium, and this day I will put the crown upon my head." Courtney told his followers that he had descended from heaven from a cloud, and he anointed them with holy oil, claiming that this would make them immune to bullets. It was clear at this point that many of his followers believed that Courtney was some kind of messiah. Courtney and his followers retreated into the woods behind the farm, Bossenden Wood. The army were called for, and the 45th Regiment, veterans of wars in India, turned up. They had 150 men, and they split into a pincer movement. On one side you had Lieutenant Bennett, and his troops found their way through Bossenden Wood. On the other hand, you had Major Armstrong trying to navigate their way around and find Courtney. It was Bennett who found them first, and Bennett ordered Courtney and his men to put down their weapons, at which point Courtney shot him dead. He became the first officer to die in Queen Victoria's reign. It was at this point that Major Armstrong turned up and began firing volleys at the farm labourers, who mainly only had cudgels to arm themselves with. 8 of Courtney's men died, including himself. One of the men took a bayonet to the face. Only one soldier was injured when his own troops accidentally fired on him. Courtney's body was taken here to the Red Lion pub, just down the road from the wood. Over the next couple of days, 20,000 people visited the site of the battle. One person left a piece of wood hammered into a tree, which read, "Here fell the true Messiah, King of the Jews." When Courtney's body was removed from the Red Lion, it was taken at a relatively swift pace, so nobody thought there was going to be a proper funerary procession. It was taken here to Herne Hill Church and laid in the graveyard in an unmarked grave. His other followers were also buried at this spot. Of Courtney's men, 30 would be arrested, 10 would be put on trial, 2 would be sentenced to death, although this was later reduced to transportation to Australia. The rest of the men were given 1 year in prison. Everyone else returned to their marginal existence, moving between the fields and the workhouse. As Fergus O'Connor in the Northern Star on the 9th of June 1838 said, "If Courtney was mad, how woeful must be the conditions of those men who will even follow a madman in the hope of change." If you have enjoyed this tale and would like to know more, why not click below? You'll find a reading link with more details on the subject. If you have more people, places or time periods you'd like me to cover, then just pop that in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more Kentish tales and tales of Kent.